Welcome to Spindle and Spoon Homestead, your place for simple living and hand spinning. Be sure to check out my blog and online shop for recipes, tutorials, and fiber art supplies. Join me in this video while I transform this pile of old clothing into a patchwork dress. If you haven't yet, you may want to check out this Part 1 video where I share how I quickly cut up old clothing so that I can upcycle them. And in this video, I'm sharing how I cut out patches, sew them together, and then use the patchwork to create a dress. The dress that I am going to be making is from a pattern by Folkwear Patterns. It's called the Russian Settler's Dress, and I'll include a link in the description below. It's a really nice pattern. Very simple, historically inspired pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is iron all of my fabric scraps because a lot of them are kind of wrinkly and I want to be sure they're nice and flat and smooth before I attempt to cut them out into patches. Then I use my rotary cutter, cutting mat, and rulers to carefully cut out some strips out of each scrap, and later I'm going to sew the strips together. So basically I'm doing a strip quilting method where you cut out identical strips of fabric, different types of fabric but identical sized or identical widths. You sew the strips together in a panel and then you cut them perpendicular to their seams to get a bunch of patchwork square strips, and this will become clear as the video goes along. One of the things I needed to determine was how to finish all of the edges of my patchwork so that they didn't unravel and fray and fall apart over time. So I'm going to share some different seam finishes with you in a moment and then share what I decided to do for this project. So I realized that one of the best ways to show you the different seam finish options would be to show you my old college sample notebook for sewing the class I took. So here is one page of seam finishes. We've got serging. So the two pieces are sewn together with a sewing machine and then the edges are serged either before or after sewing together. These are, I forget what this is called, but the edges are just turned under. So you sew it together and then press and turn under and sew the edges. This is zigzagged on the edges. This is a blind stitch. I don't really see that very often. And then this section has the French seam. French seam, you sew it together wrong sides together, then trim it a little bit and put it right sides together and sew the seam again so that the seam edges are enclosed like that. This is a flat felled seam. often used with jeans. This is the right side. This is the same seam that you see on the jeans side seams sometimes. So for this one, you sew right sides together, then you trim one seam allowance shorter than the other, and you fold over, you press both to one side and you fold the longer seam allowance over underneath and stitch it down like that. So it has one row of top stitching. And this is a welted seam that I don't think I actually did right. Because a welted seam is where it's a lot like a flat felled seam, but instead of folding under that raw edge, you just stitch it down, and maybe you finish it in some way before that, like with a zigzag stitch, pinking shears, or a serger. Then you just stitch it down. So it looks a lot like a flat felled seam from this side, but on the inside, on the wrong side, this edge will have some kind of finishing, like serging stitches or something like that. But it looks like I totally did this wrong, and I just made another flat felled seam. So I guess I didn't understand the assignment. But for my patchwork dress, I basically did a welted seam, and on the wrong side I didn't finish the stitches, the seam allowances at all. I just stitched them down up right along the edge with a really short stitch length. So it's a type of welted seam. This is my patchwork skirt that I purchased, just used, because, I mean, it's amazing. But it says it is made in India and has all these beautiful Indian print cotton fabrics. And the way whoever made this did a really good job. So they did something really different here. It looks like they sewed two patches together, and before sewing they kind of like folded it under a little bit, so it has this flap here, kind of like a French seam, but it's not really a French seam. The seam edges are not enclosed. They're just kind of tacked down, but there's only one line of stitching. So I'm not sure what you would call that, but it's very efficient and it's working really well. You can see there's a little bit of unraveling here and there, but nothing major. And this is a vintage skirt. I don't know how old it is, but it's not brand new. And then for the different tiers of patches, they stitched them together and then also serged the edges. And it's holding up really well. So the point of sharing all of that is just to show you how many different options you have when you're finishing seams. And with a patchwork garment, you do need to consider finishing the seams in some way because there are so many raw edges. And there are a few other options that I didn't discuss, but if you go to my blog post about sewing patchwork clothing, which I'll link in the description below, I write about each of the different seam finishing techniques and also a few other ideas that would prevent patchwork clothing from getting really unraveled and scraggly looking. So be sure to check out that blog post for more thorough ideas. For my project, taking into consideration the types of fabric that I was using and just the equipment that I had and how much time I wanted to spend and the amount of wear and tear that the item would probably get, I decided to use the welted seam method with a really, really short stitch length. The stitch length is the length of each individual machine stitch, and it's measured in millimeters, I think. So you can change that setting on your sewing machine. And if your stitch length is really big, then your stitches are less durable. And if your stitch length is really small, then your stitches are more durable and can also prevent unraveling to a certain extent. However, with a short stitch length, it's also a lot more difficult to unpick. So you don't want to use a short stitch length for anything you might need to adjust later. So I sewed all of these strips that I had cut out with a short stitch length. Then I pressed them. And the next step, what I should have done here is done my welted seam where I sewed down the edge, the seam allowances, but I forgot to do that until later. I was really excited about seeing all the patchwork squares. So I cut out the strips perpendicular to make my little strips of patchwork squares. And if you're wondering at this point if this project was very time consuming, the answer is yes. I thought I might be able to stack up layers of these strip panels and cut them all at the same time, but because of all the different types of fabric, it would be much more exact to just do one layer at a time, so I did not stack them, although that would have saved me a whole lot of time. But these fabrics are kind of slinky and shifty rayons and silks, and they just weren't playing well with stacking them all together neatly. If you have a much sturdier or stiffer fabric, like a quilting cotton, you could totally stack layers together and get all that cutting done much faster. I spent a lot of time smoothing and patting each of these panels so that I could cut out my squares straight, because this fabric was very shifty. Now this is the pattern. There's literally just one pattern piece plus the straps and the upper band for this dress. This is the Russian Settler's Dress by Folkwear Patterns. So what I decided to do was lay out my little strips of squares onto the one pattern piece, and I needed 4 pieces of this pattern piece. So I laid out these strips in order to make sure that I didn't have 2 of the same kind of square touching each other or too close together, like a big group of the same fabric or something like that. And I also needed to decide if I wanted my square patches to be offset from each other or more like a grid. So I spent a lot of time laying out all of my little patches to make sure it looked the way that I wanted, and to make sure I had enough for 4 layers for the 4 pieces, 2 fronts and 2 backs. Then I started sewing the strips together. Here you can see me stitching down that second stitch for the welted seam. I'm stitching down the seam allowance with a very short stitch length. Here you can see my welted seams that have raw edges with the very, very short stitch length. It was a method that I thought would be not too bulky for my flowy dress and flowy fabrics. It wouldn't be too time consuming. And in general, I'm really happy with the choice that I made. Once I had my 4 panels for the 2 front pieces and the 2 back pieces, I was ready to cut out the actual pattern piece. So I got all of my layers lined up perfectly and put down my pattern piece. I really like using pattern weights. If you haven't switched from pins to weights for cutting out patterns, I highly recommend it. And I used the little leftover bits to cut out my straps and the top band. And then it was time to sew the dress pieces together. Part of the dress pattern includes some gathers on the back, and I just sewed a simple gather stitch several rows according to the pattern. The actual pattern suggests doing pleating or smocking, but I was just doing a very simple gather stitch. For the straps and the top band, I used some fusible interfacing because this fabric is somewhat delicate and those straps are going to get the most stress during wear. So I wanted to make them a little more sturdy. Sewing on the top band is probably the most challenging part of this pattern, but I don't think it's as complicated as sewing on sleeves or zippers, so this could be possibly a good beginner pattern. I did decide to use my serger to serge the side seams. Making the straps is really straightforward, and I also interfaced them. Originally I thought I would make the straps and the band out of a contrasting fabric, but I couldn't find anything that I really liked, and I'm really glad I went with the patchwork scraps. I think it looks really cute. These straps sew into a V at the center back. And last of all was the hem. I just made a very tiny hem where I turned over the edge about 1/4 inch 2 times and sewed it down. And here's the finished dress. I'm wearing it with the Aeronite pants by Sew Liberated. I'm really happy with this dress, made out of my old clothes. It goes really well over a blouse or a long-sleeved tee for when it's colder. The back is super cute with the V and the gathers. It's extremely comfortable. It is winter, so I've been pairing it with a shawl. You can just wear the shawl loose, or this dress looks pretty good belted as well. So I tried styling it with a belted shawl look. And here's the dress with a belt and no shawl. In the pattern actually comes with an apron as well, and the apron has this kind of natural waist tie, so this is why I wanted to try it with the belt. Mostly I don't wear it belted, but in some cases I think it looks really nice for some outfits. So that's my patchwork dress. I am really happy with it. Of course, the big question is, will the seams unravel? Here's my dress out of the washer. I washed it on a gentle cycle for delicates, which is what I do with all of my handmade clothing. So let's see how the seams are faring. I didn't put it in the dryer, I just air dried it. So we do have some unraveling a little bit, which I expected, but I just am hoping that it doesn't cause any holes to appear. And honestly, only time will tell, but with my tiny stitch length, I'm hoping that it will keep the unraveling at bay. And we will see. Be sure to check out my blog post where I go into some detail about the different options for finishing seams with a patchwork garment. And I promised at the end of my blog post that if this dress totally falls apart, I will update the post and let everybody know. Thank you so much for watching, everybody, and let me know with a comment if you like my dress, if you have ever made patchwork clothing and what kind of things worked for you, or if you have any other fun upcycling projects that you have done. And also don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much.